Hi Laura, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you.
It's lovely to be chatting with you. We are both in a very sunny London at the moment, and we're here to talk about your new book, The New Age of Sexism: How the AI Revolution is Reinventing Misogyny. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an intro in case some of our readers aren't familiar with your work. So you are a writer, activist, and founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, which is a website that catalogues experiences of gender inequality. And your work has shaped the conversation around gender and the internet for over a decade now. Let's delve in. The topics covered in your book, AI girlfriends to schools gripped by an epidemic of online sexual abuse, they feel like issues that perhaps we're just starting to wrap our heads around as a society. Why did it feel important to write this book in this very moment?
I think it feels important for me because I think we're standing on the edge of a precipice where our society is about to be transformed in ways we can barely imagine by AI, by emerging technologies, by metaverses. And if we don't think about the implications of that now, and if we don't, as citizens, demand certain safeguards, certain reasonable forms of equality in the process of that change, then we are going to wake up in a few years' time and look around and find ourselves in a world where the forms of inequality and prejudice that we know now are inextricably not just built into the building blocks of our future world, but actually amplified and magnified. So this is such an important moment of opportunity. If we don't talk about this now, then it will be really difficult to disentangle it later on.
And there's a line in your first book, Everyday Sexism, where you say, essentially, sexism doesn't occupy an acceptable position in our discourse, and we have this general willingness to laugh at it and ignore it rather than define it the prejudice that it actually is. And you wrote that over 10 years ago. Do you think anything's changed since then?
I think the conversation has shifted to a degree. I think that fewer people would now say there's no such thing as sexism, women are making a fuss about nothing, than they would have done back then, although some people will still say that. I think that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the millions of courageous women through all sorts of different means, including the Everyday Sexism Project, but also Me Too and Everyone's Invited, who have done so much to shine a light, often at great personal cost, on the reality of the situation. And that has done an incredible thing in that I think as a society we are more aware of the problem. What I think we haven't done is we haven't necessarily learned from that. So we haven't necessarily seen the structural changes that we need to see as a result of those conversations. And also what we are still seeing is that when things crop up that are new, we fall into the same old traps of brushing them off, not taking them seriously. So particularly, for example, with misogynistic extremism, when we see people being groomed and radicalized online into hatred of women, we don't describe that as radicalization. We describe it as banter. We don't describe people who are pushing agendas that are terrorist agendas, that are incitement to offline violence as terrorists. We describe them as controversial influencers. And even when men act in the names of these ideologies and actually do commit acts of mass violence, we don't consider it to be terrorism or extremism. So we are still making the same mistakes to a degree.
And speaking of quote unquote controversial influencers like Andrew Tate, I know you've spoken about how in schools children are moving away for watching content like him, who, said women belong in the home and they are a man's property and women should bear responsibility for sexual assault, and moving towards things like deepfake pornography. And I wonder if you could just talk to me a little bit about what you've seen and what you found through your research for your book and your work in schools.
Yes. So what we're seeing now is that young people are more likely to be downloading apps or visiting websites where there are tools easily, readily available, easy to find, that they can, usually for free, because there's often a free option or a free trial setting, they can take fully clothed pictures of any woman or girl from the internet or screen grabbed from social media. They can feed them into these tools and they will produce highly realistic looking pornographic images and videos. So what we are seeing now, very often young children, we're often talking about children around the age of 11 or 12 when this is happening, or their female teachers, and those images are then circulated widely. This is the next big epidemic of sexual violence. It's just that we're not talking about it yet. And when it does happen, schools aren't responding to it particularly well.
I heard you talking, I think, in another interview about saying that these ideas aren't exactly new. They've always existed. You've always been able to find someone like Andrew Tate spouting these ideas. But what's different now is the algorithm, right?
Absolutely. the misogyny is outdated. Nothing Andrew Tate says is particularly new or exciting. But for the first time in history, there's always been a backlash, and there have always been voices like his in response to perceived social justice progress. What we are seeing that's different is that very, very rich men have decided to put the weight of their incredibly powerful algorithms behind him and other voices like his. And the only reason for that is because increasingly extreme content makes people watch for longer and it makes them more money. But the offline ramifications of that are significant because the power of those algorithms are so great. So we're talking about, if you look at one platform, if you look at just TikTok alone, Andrew Tate's content there has been viewed over 11.4 billion times, more than the number of people on the planet. So the scale and reach of the backlash that we're seeing now is unlike anything that we've ever seen before. And the societal impact of that is clear for the first time ever now. When you look at attitude surveys, which ask the public their attitudes about women, about sexual violence, it always used to be the case that there were some people who were accepting of those attitudes, but it was always the case previously that those attitudes were strongest in the oldest cohort surveyed. What we're seeing change for the first time ever, which is really heartbreaking, is that the people with the most extreme, most misogynistic, most regressive views about women are now the youngest men surveyed. And that's why this matters, because it is really shifting and changing our society in ways that are very dangerous and very regressive.
And what about for women and girls who are victims of this stuff? I mean, one of the stats that stood out in your book, that when it comes to deepfake pornography, there's basically nothing that is being done or can be done, because in most countries around the world, creating and sharing this stuff remains legal. I mean, where does that leave us?
Yeah, I mean, it leaves us completely unprotected, and it has resulted in so many situations where women's lives have been decimated by this, and there has been absolutely no legal redress, no access to justice. I spoke to young women for this book whose lives have been destroyed. They've been left with PTSD, their careers have been ruined, and the perpetrators have experienced absolutely no impact whatsoever. Technology always lags distressingly behind justice when it comes particularly to male violence against women and girls. And we need to address that. We need to look at new rules, new laws. We need to look at transnational legislation to recognise the fact that this is so often a global issue. We also need to address the societal roots of the problem of why people are using the technology in this way. The technology itself isn't inherently problematic. The people are. It's the way in which people are adopting and using it. And all the laws in the world won't fix that. And it's particularly hard to imagine any kind of sort of utopian future that we could reach through legislation when we are already in a situation in England and Wales where less than 2% of rapes reported to the police even result in a perpetrator being charged or summoned. So, it feels useless to try and suggest legal remedy when we are at a point when rape has effectively been decriminalised.
And there are a few laws, right, that have been passed. Like I know the UK criminalises the creation of deepfakes, and then there's a legislation that got passed in the US about deepfake porn. What do you make of those regulations and their effectiveness to be able to hopefully help women?
I think it depends on how they're implemented, and that's what will remain to be seen. Is their awareness when people are creating this legislation, they also need to be prepared to allocate the necessary resources to see it through. I mean, at present, we have one phone helpline in the UK for these kinds of offences, and it's drowning. It's completely overwhelmed. People who are on a long, long waiting list, unable to get support. If we have a situation where, as we're on course by the end of 2025 to see 8 million new deepfakes created, and we know that 99% of those are sexual, are we actually going to be able to police this in reality, and what will and what should that look like? That's why the law is important, but I actually think what's more important is education, working with schools to prevent young people from growing up in a world where it is considered an acceptable and an appealing and aspirational thing to do, to create an abusive fake pornographic image of a girl that you know, but also putting pressure on tech regulation, preventing these tools from being accessible in the first place to anyone really, but particularly to very young children. It's not just about the apps themselves, it's about asking difficult questions about search engines and app stores, about why they are making them so easily available in the first place.
There was a story that I remember from your book about one girl who had a deepfake pornography video that she tried to ring that helpline and they just couldn't help her because they were totally overwhelmed. So she sort of just got left to deal with it on her own, which is heartbreaking.
Yes, and eventually develop PTSD. I mean, very much because of the incident itself, not because of what happened with the helpline. And she herself says, they do amazing work. But this frontline women's sector is overloaded. I'm the patron of a brilliant rape crisis service, which has thousands of people on its waiting list. We are desperate for funding and support, and that funding should be ring-fenced. These incredible, highly specialised frontline workers shouldn't be spending half of their time scrabbling around looking for funding, trying to keep the lights on. They should be able to depend on that funding coming in and use their time and expertise to help survivors. It's a really desperate situation.
And I wondered, could you talk to me a little bit about the sexual assault that's happening in the metaverse? Because you write in it that actually it's a place where people particularly don't seem to want to talk about it or address it. And you talk in your book, there's an incident where you watch a male avatar grab a woman's bum. The moderator doesn't really do anything, and then everyone was outraged, and then within a couple of minutes everyone had kind of come back to their conversations. Like, is there something different about the metaverse in our unwillingness to look at it in the face?
No, I mean, I started the Everyday Sexism Project after being sexually assaulted in a very similar way on a bus, and I said what was happening out loud and everybody looked out the window. So this isn't a new thing. The sexual violence isn't new, and the societal shrugging and turning away isn't new. But what is new is the location and the venue. And I think what we can say is this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to build what you are telling us is the future in our world. Don't you want to build it with a higher bar built in? Don't you want to start from a starting point where this isn't a place that's unsafe and unpleasant for women and girls? If you want us to come in, at present, research suggests that users are exposed to abusive behavior every 7 minutes in the metaverse. And that was very much correlated with my experience. Sexual harassment, sexual comments, and even virtual simulated sexual violence were rife. Nobody does anything about it. I didn't see any moderators taking any action or any kind of consequences. What that means is Meta claims to be building the future, but it's building a future that has no appeal and no place for women. And that's something they need to grapple with. When you talk about this stuff, people say it's virtual. I can't believe you're taking this seriously. It doesn't matter. It's not the same. Just take the headset off and walk away, and lots of other things like that. And that, again, it's nothing new. Women have been told for decades, don't make a fuss about street harassment. You're lucky he didn't rape you. Don't make a fuss about, coercive control. At least he's not giving you a black eye. We've always used this, it could be worse, defense to ignore certain forms of trauma and violence against women. But there are some interesting things that we need to think about here. The first is, yes, at present, this is virtual, but it doesn't have to be the same form of harm to be a form of harm. And actually, women being excluded from this space matters if you want it to become the world of tomorrow. They're investing billions of dollars in making this a place where we are meant to be in the future, sitting in classrooms and lecture theatres and meeting our friends and watching events and going on dates and having boardroom meetings. And in order to do that, at that point, it won't be possible to say to a young girl, well, just take off your headset and walk away. She's going to be in class. So we need to fix it now for that reason. And the next thing is that we know that the technology is developing at pace. They are already developing full body haptic suits where you will be able to step into something that will make it feel like you are really there. When you sit down in the metaverse, you will feel yourself sitting down. When you touch something, you will feel that object. And that also means that very soon the experience of being assaulted there is going to feel very real. So there's all sorts of reasons why we need to get this right now, but not least just the humanity of women and girls. We know that this has a significant psychological impact. How can we be building a new world and not aiming a tiny bit higher in terms of including them?
And it already feels real, right? Like, it doesn't matter that it's in the virtual space. Like, you talk about an incident with a gun where people were shooting and your heart was racing because the gun was pointed to you. So whether it's virtual or not, like, the experience still feels real.
Yeah, and people accept that in other ways. Like, anyone who's sat in a 3D cinema and seen an object come hurtling towards them and gasped or ducked out of the way recognizes that their bodily response will often relate to something as if it's real, even when it's virtual. But there are situations like that, and people will say that as well. People will say, oh, this is just like when I'm shot in a video game, I don't really die. But when you're playing a video game, you step into that video game expecting to play it, and consenting, and that is your expectation of the experience you're about to have. That's a very different thing from stepping into a space where you're expecting to socialize or to do something else and finding that somebody is assaulting you.
At the Fuller Project, I cover labour. And so a lot of your book was really interesting to me in how a lot of this intersects with workplaces. For example, you visit that immersive cyber brothel in Europe. Customers are paying for sessions, for sex dolls, but that industry is also impacting sex workers, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's ironic is that, of course, sex workers are going to be the first people to be impacted by this, and yet their voices are so often missing from the conversation. What we're talking about is a kind of revolution in terms of creating technology that will be readily available to men, that attempts in every possible way to imitate and replicate real life women. And it is explicitly designed to try and blur the boundaries and trick those men into thinking that these are real life women. It's not advertised as a robotic experience. In fact, when you visit the cyber brothel, you'll receive messages in advance that kind of purport to come from the robot that you're visiting, you know, saying she can't wait to meet you and so on. Everything is deliberately designed to blur the boundaries. And it's the same with sex robot manufacturers. You know, they're self-warming, they're self-lubricating, they will use AI so that you can create their personality. So everything is being done to kind of trick men into thinking of these as experiences with real women. But of course, the one thing that these robots or dolls lack is the ability to consent, which means that when I visited the cyber brothel, the first thing I saw was that the doll on the bed had one of its labia torn off. And so from there, I think you can start to wonder about the impact of those same people interacting with and visiting sex workers, real women, and the voices of those women that I include in the book include them quite understandably saying this is going to affect the way that we're treated and people's assumptions about how they can treat us and how we should be expected to behave. And that really matters. And it is also true that it will then by extension impact the ways in which we see men interacting with the real women in their lives.
Talking about the labia having been ripped off, there's some quite dark stuff in the book. What impact does that have on you as a person or a woman as you're spending time in this world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does have a significant impact, and it is very difficult and dark and upsetting work. But I also think that there is, for me, a sense of such urgency to it, a sense of I need to go back and tell people about what I've seen here because people don't know about this. When I wrote Men Who Hate Women 5 years ago, most people were not talking about incels. When I told people what I was researching, people asked me things like, is that a kind of battery? Or there is a sense of people need to know about this and they need to know about it before it's too late. And I find that helpful as a means of contextualizing something that is really upsetting within a framework of there is a purpose for this and I'm going to try and do something about it.
And was there anything in the book that you didn't include because it felt too dark or too upsetting?
Yes, and it was very much across the content relating to sex robots and deepfake technology. There is a lot of crossover with child sexual abuse. Though I mention that and allude to it in the book to a degree, some of what I found there was just too upsetting to include.
As normal internet users, then, is there anything that we can do to help? Or is that not a useful way of thinking about it? Because obviously we should be holding the tech companies accountable and we should be teaching people.
Well, the first thing we need to be aware of is that we are affected by this whether we're on the internet or not. I think there's a misconception actually that this is about online harms, but really the whole point of this book is that AI is infusing every element of our day-to-day lives. So this isn't something we can choose to opt out of. This isn't something we can avoid by not going online. For example, the AI that we know is being used by global financial services firms in credit application vetting is already discriminating against women's likelihood of receiving a loan. We know that it's impacting in job recruitment where big companies are using AI to whittle down the applicants applying for jobs before they decide who to interview. And again, those programs have been shown systematically to discriminate against women, against marginalized groups. So we are all being affected by this quite a lot of the time, whether we are online or not. And that's the first thing that we need to know as citizens. There is this false sense that there is an online and offline divide, and that if we just stay out of the right online spaces, then we can protect ourselves from this. This is about to become so much bigger than that. So the first thing I think is to inform ourselves, because to be informed is to be forewarned and to be aware. And then I think, yes, you're right, it's regulation rather than individual action that we need to see, but that doesn't mean that we as individual citizens can't collectively come together to demand that regulation. So it is about supporting campaigns which are calling on governments and calling on politicians to take action, to recognise that there is a really limited window of opportunity here to take that action, and really demanding as voters that this is an issue that we care about.
Lastly then, what do you hope people will take away from this book?
Partly, I think, awareness and helping to support people to recognise this problem, and that, you know, we need to be aware of it so we can stand up against it. I mean, I hope people come away from this book without a sense of it being anti-tech. This isn't about saying, let's go back to the dark ages. It's not about being scared of technology. It's about saying that this technology is too important to be monopolized by a group of obscenely wealthy men whose only interest is in profit for themselves and their shareholders. So I also hope it fires people up to feel that they can be involved in jumping in and getting involved in shaping what some of this tech will look like. I mean, one of the things we most need is for young women to be inspired to think, I'm going to go into AI and I'm going to build tools that do brilliant things. Yeah. Because at present, women are only 12% of AI researchers. So we really need to diversify the field of people creating these tools as well if we want to create change.
To end on a slightly lighter note, I was going to ask you for some TV or book or film recommendations. Like, what are you watching or reading at the moment?
I'm reading Madeline Miller at the moment,
nice.
Which I guess is kind of funny because I'm talking about the future and she's retelling the past. She's a brilliant writer, for anyone who hasn't come across her, who rewrites myths and legends from a feminist perspective. And her books are The Song of Achilles and Circe. And she always brings me comfort. And I suppose a sense that even centuries later, there can still be things that can be done to redress the balance. That's a comforting thing.
Yeah, I've just actually finished The Song of Achilles and it is a gorgeous book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's been wonderful to talk to you and would recommend the book to everyone. It's very sobering, but very eye-opening. So thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much for your time. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much, Laura.